The year is 1913. Deep in the Yorkshire countryside, far from London's glittering society, construction crews are raising something impossible. Stone by stone, a palace emerges from English soil. Not a royal residence, not an ancient seat of power. This is the dream of one man who was never supposed to matter. Edwin Lutyens, the architect, stands in the half-finished Great Hall and looks up at scaffolding that climbs toward a ceiling designed to soar 70 feet. The bills are mounting. The owner's fortune, built on grocery stores and shipping, is hemorrhaging into limestone and oak. In the servants' quarters below ground, corridors stretch into darkness. Boiler rooms, laundries, kitchens built to feed a small army. This house will employ more than 80 people to keep it breathing. Most will earn less in a year than a single chandelier costs. And the owner? He will never see it finished. Within a decade, war will shatter the world this palace was built to celebrate. The house will be seized, converted, nearly lost. But somehow, against every rational prediction, it will survive. And in surviving, it will change the fate of a nation. This is the story of Castle Drogo, the last castle built in England, and the first time you learn its real story. This is the story of Castle Drogo, a house that should never have existed. Stand at the edge of Dartmoor, on the granite cliffs above the Tyne Gorge, and you can see it rising from the rock like it grew there. Battlements, towers, walls 3 feet thick. It looks medieval, ancien, permanent. It is none of those things. Castle Drogo was built between 1911 and 1930 by a man named Julius Drew, a grocer's son who made a fortune in tea and provisions, who bought himself a Norman pedigree that probably wasn't real, and who believed that stone and mortar could rewrite history, that a big enough house could turn a shopkeeper into a nobleman. He hired Edwin Lutyens, the greatest architect of the age, and told him to build something eternal. Lutyens designed a fortress, massive, austere, built from Dartmoor granite cut from the estate's own quarries. No ornament for ornament's sake, every line serving both beauty and function. The result was architectural genius. It was also financial catastrophe. But this is not just a story about one man's ambition. It is a story about what happens when private dreams collide with public history. About the workers who cut stone in freezing rain and carried it up a mountainside. About the servants who lived in the bowels of the building, invisible, essential, exploited even when treated kindly. About a family that poured everything into permanence and watched it slip away. Castle Drogo would be requisitioned during 2 world wars. It would fall into disrepair. The family would lose control. The National Trust would take it over and then, in the 21st century, discover that the building was literally falling apart. Water had been seeping through the granite for decades. The walls were saturated. The castle was dying. What followed was the most ambitious conservation project in British history. 10 years, millions of pounds, and a decision that changed how the nation thought about heritage, about whose stories deserved preservation, and about what these grand houses actually mean. This is not the story they tell on the guided tours. This is the story of who paid for Drogo, how close it came to vanishing, and why saving it mattered more than anyone expected. This is the dark, complicated, essential story of Castle Drogo. Julius Drew was born in 1856 into a world that did not want him. His family ran a draper's shop in London. Respectable, certainly, but not landed, not titled, not the kind of people who appeared in Burke's Peerage or received invitations to country estates. Victorian England had strict rules about class, and Julius understood them perfectly. Money could buy many things. Acceptance was not one of them. By the time he was 33, Julius had done something extraordinary. He had co-founded the Home and Colonial Stores, a chain of grocery shops that revolutionized British retail. The business model was simple and devastatingly effective. Buy in bulk, sell cheap, expand fast. Within a decade, the company operated hundreds of stores. Julius became a millionaire. The fortune was real. The respect he craved remained just out of reach. So he did what many self-made men of his era attempted. He tried to buy his way backward into history. The home and colonial stores were not elegant, they were efficient. Rows of shops across Britain selling tea, sugar, butter, bacon, products ordinary families could afford. The margins were thin, but the volume was massive. Julius understood economies of scale before the term was common. He built warehouses, negotiated directly with suppliers, cut out middlemen. The profits accumulated steadily year after year. By 1889, Julius had enough money to retire. He was 33 years old. Most men would have relaxed into comfortable obscurity. Julius could not. The wealth meant nothing if it did not elevate him. He looked at the aristocracy, at families whose names carried weight simply because they had carried weight for centuries, and he wanted that permanence, that legitimacy. The problem was mechanical. You could not simply declare yourself gentry. Marriage into an established family was one route, but Julius had already married Frances Richardson, daughter of a country gentleman, respectable but not aristocratic. Purchasing land was another path. Land signaled permanence. But land alone was not enough. Every industrial millionaire was buying estates. What Julius needed was a story, a narrative that connected his wealth to something older, something that predated groceries and balance sheets. He needed ancestors, and if the ancestors were not there, well, Victorian genealogy was flexible enough to find them. The search began quietly. Records were consulted, parish registers examined, family trees sketched and revised. Julius was looking for a connection, any connection, that would tie the name Drew to Norman nobility. What he found, or what he was told he had found, would shape everything that followed. It would determine where he built, what he built, and why, despite all the money and all the effort, the dream would never quite deliver what he wanted most. In 1889, Julius hired a genealogist. The brief was specific. Trace the Drew family name back as far as possible. Find a connection to nobility. Prove that this grocer's son had aristocratic blood, however diluted. The genealogist delivered exactly what Julius wanted. A theory presented as fact that the Drews descended from Drogo de Tyne, a Norman baron who had supposedly held land in Devon after the conquest of 1066. The evidence was thin, the logic was thinner. Scholars today regard the claim as mostly fantasy, a convenient invention built on coincidental surnames and wishful thinking. Julius believed it completely. Or, perhaps more accurately, he chose to believe it because belief gave him what he needed. A story, a justification, a reason to build a castle on the very land his supposed ancestor had once ruled. If the Drews were Norman nobility, then Julius was not an upstart. He was reclaiming his birthright. The genealogy rested on fragments, a mention of a Drogo in Domesday Book, a reference to land holdings near the River Tyne in Devon, a surname that might have evolved from Drogo to Drew over 9 centuries. Each link was plausible in isolation. Together they formed a chain that could not bear scrutiny, but scrutiny was not the point. Julius was not writing an academic paper. He was constructing an identity. He began using the name Drogo in family correspondence. He researched Norman castles, studying their layouts and defensive features. He traveled to Devon and walked the land above the Tyne Gorge, imagining his ancestors standing on the same granite outcrops, surveying the same river valley. The emotional reality became more powerful than the historical truth. In 1910, Julius purchased land at Drystanton, a village whose name seemed to confirm the connection. The location was remote. Dartmoor stretched in every direction, wild and unforgiving. The nearest railway station was miles away in Exeter. Access required a long drive over rough moorland roads. For most people, this isolation would have been a deterrent. For Julius, it was essential. His castle needed to stand apart, visible from a distance, dominating the landscape the way a medieval fortress would have. The choice of site revealed something about Julius's psychology. He was not building a comfortable country house where he could entertain London society. He was building a monument, a physical argument in stone that the Drew family belonged to this land, that they had always belonged, that the centuries of trade and commerce were merely an interlude before the family returned to its rightful place. The fact that the pedigree was largely invented did not matter to Julius. What mattered was that he believed it, and that belief, backed by a grocer's fortune, would be enough to raise a castle. Edwin Lutyens received the commission in 1910. He was 41 years old, at the peak of his powers, already famous for country houses that blended classical proportion with arts and crafts detail. He had designed Munstead wood for Gertrude Jekyll. He was working on grand civic projects. He understood scale, materials, and how to make a building feel inevitable, as though it had always been there. Julius Drew's request was unlike anything Lutyens had tackled. He wanted a castle, not a Gothic revival fantasy with decorative battlements. A real fortress, thick walls, defensible towers, built from Dartmoor granite, quarried on site, using local stone that had formed over millions of years. Lutyens was intrigued. The site itself was extraordinary. A granite outcrop high above the Tane Gorge, with views across Dartmoor that stretched for miles. The location demanded boldness. Lutyens began to sketch. What emerged was not pastiche, but something stranger and more compelling. A castle stripped of medievalism's ornament, reduced to mass and void, light and shadow, modern in its restraint, ancient in its materials, impossible in its ambition. The early designs were vast. Lutyens envisioned a complex with multiple courtyards, extensive service wings, and a great hall that would rival medieval precedents. The drawings showed a building that would take decades to complete and cost a fortune even by Drew's standards. Julius loved them. He saw in Lutyens' lines everything he wanted: strength, permanence, legitimacy rendered in stone. But Lutyens understood something Julius did not yet grasp. Building a castle in the 20th century was an act of architectural theatre. Castles had been made obsolete by gunpowder centuries earlier. Their defensive features, thick walls, narrow windows, battlements, served no practical purpose in 1910. What Lutyens was designing was a symbolic fortress, a building that looked backward to assert timelessness while incorporating every modern convenience: electricity, central heating, plumbing, elevators. The granite posed technical challenges. Dartmoor stone was hard, dense, and difficult to work. It could not be carved with the delicacy of limestone or sandstone. Every detail had to be simplified, bold, sculptural. Lutyens adapted his vocabulary. He eliminated ornament. He let the mass of the stone speak for itself. The result was a building that felt both medieval and modernist, a castle that could have been built in 1320 or 1920, timeless because it refused easy historical placement. Lutyens visited the site repeatedly. He walked the granite cliffs. He studied the light, the way it moved across the moorland, the way weather came fast from the west. He positioned the castle to command the view, to look impregnable even though its walls would never face siege. The design was theatre, but it was serious theatre. Lutyens was giving Julius Drew the legitimacy he craved, not through genealogy, but through architecture. If the building was convincing enough, the story would become true. Construction began in 1911. The first task was not building but extraction. Dartmoor granite is some of the hardest stone in Britain. Dense, weather-resistant, nearly impossible to work. Quarries were opened on the estate itself. Men arrived from Devon villages and further afield. Quarrymen, blasters, stonemasons. They worked 6 days a week. Wages were modest. Conditions were brutal. Granite does not yield easily. It must be split along its grain, a process that requires precision, patience, and a tolerance for physical punishment. Workers drove wedges into cracks, hammered until stone fractured, then shaped blocks by hand with chisels and mallets. Dust filled the air. Chips flew. Fingers were crushed. Backs bent under loads that weighed hundreds of pounds. Each block had to be hauled from the quarry to the building site, up steep grades, along rough tracks. Horses strained, men cursed. Progress was measured in feet per day, not miles. This was not romantic. This was industrial-scale manual labor, done in a landscape that offered no shelter from wind or rain. The quarrymen worked in teams. One man held the chisel while another swung the hammer. The rhythm was constant: position, strike, reposition, strike. A single block might take hours to dress properly. The stone had to meet Lutyens's specifications exactly: thickness, dimensions, surface finish. Any block that failed inspection was rejected, the labor wasted. Injuries were common. Granite splinters caused eye damage. Heavy blocks crushed feet. The cold seeped into joints. Men worked through pain because stopping meant losing wages. There were no safety regulations, no compensation for injury, no sick leave. If you could not work, someone else took your place. The site foreman kept a roster and a ledger. Names were recorded, hours logged, wages calculated. Skilled stonemasons earned more than laborers, but even the best-paid workers made a fraction of what Lutyens billed for a single site visit. The disparity was not hidden. It was simply accepted as the natural order. Housing was provided for some workers: rough cottages near the quarries, basic shelter against the Dartmoor weather. Families moved to the site. Children played among the stone chips. Women cooked and washed for the crews. The work site became a temporary village, sustained entirely by Drew's money and the workers' endurance. Photographs from the era show men in flat caps and rough wool, standing beside blocks taller than themselves. Their faces are weathered, expressions unreadable. They are nameless in most records. The archives preserve Lutyens's drawings, Drew's correspondence, contractor invoices. The workers appear as line items: labor, stone cutting, transport. Their individual stories, their injuries, their frustrations, their pride in the work, none of that was deemed worth recording. They built the castle. History remembered the architect and the owner. The men who cut the stone vanished into footnotes. The walls of Castle Drogo are not decoration. They are structure, built to carry immense loads and to last for centuries. Lutyens specified granite blocks cut to precise dimensions, laid in courses with minimal mortar, relying on weight and fit to hold the mass together. The exterior walls measure 3 feet thick in places. Some internal walls run nearly 2 feet. The sheer volume of stone required was staggering: thousands of tons. Each block was numbered, logged, and placed according to Lutyens's drawings. Masons worked from scaffolding that climbed as the walls rose. The Great Hall was designed to soar. Its walls had to support not only their own weight but the roof structure above, timber trusses spanning vast open space. Every joint mattered. Every cut had to be true. A single misaligned stone could compromise the entire section. The work was slow, deliberate, unforgiving. By 1914, 3 years into construction, the walls were perhaps halfway to their intended height. Then the world fractured. The scale of the masonry work can only be understood by standing at the base of the walls and looking up. The granite rises in perfect courses, each block fitting against its neighbors with almost no visible mortar line. This is not accidental. Lutyens wanted the walls to read as monolithic, as though the entire castle had been carved from a single piece of stone rather than assembled block by block. To achieve this, masons had to work with extraordinary precision. Modern power tools did not exist. Every cut was made by hand. Every surface was dressed with hammer and chisel. The granite resisted. It dulled tools quickly. A chisel might last a few days before needing to be reforged by the blacksmith. The rhythm of the work was dictated by the stone's hardness. Scaffolding rose with the walls. Timber poles lashed together with rope. Platforms built at intervals. Workers carried blocks up ladders or hauled them using rope and pulley. At height, the work became more dangerous. Wind gusted across the exposed moorland. Rain made platforms slick. Men worked in all weather because delays meant cost overruns, and Julius Drew, for all his wealth, was watching the budget with increasing anxiety. The Great Hall presented unique challenges. Its walls rose higher than any other section, climbing toward a ceiling that would eventually reach 70 feet. The interior had to remain open, unobstructed by columns or supports. All the weight had to be carried by the perimeter walls and transferred down to the foundations. Lutyens's calculations were precise, but building to those calculations required masons who understood load, compression, and balance. The walls took years to complete. Stone cutting continued through 1913 to 1914 into the war years. Even as the workforce thinned, even as materials grew scarce, the walls kept climbing. They were the irreducible core of Lutyens' design. Without them, there was no castle. Everything else, roof, floors, fittings, depended on these granite walls standing firm. And they did. A century later, they still do. August 1914. Britain declared war on Germany. Construction at Castle Drogo did not stop immediately, but the workforce began to thin. Younger men enlisted or were conscripted. Skilled tradesmen left for munitions factories where wages were higher and the work deemed essential. Materials became scarce. Timber, steel, even certain types of stone were diverted to the war effort. Julius Drew, now in his late 50s, watched his dreams slow to a crawl. His own sons joined the military. Adrian Drew, the eldest, served as an officer. In 1917, Adrian was killed in France. The loss shattered Julius. The castle, already a monument to ambition and invented ancestry, took on a new weight. It became a memorial, a place to anchor grief. Julius pushed to resume construction after the war, but the world had changed. Labor costs had risen. The economy was unstable. The certainty of the Edwardian age, the belief that wealth and class would endure forever, had evaporated in the mud of the Somme. Adrian's death broke something in Julius that would never heal. He had built the castle partly for his children, imagining a lineage that would stretch forward as the invented pedigree stretched backward. Now the heir was gone. The castle stood half-finished, walls rising but empty, echoing with absence rather than life. Construction limped forward through 1915 and 1916 with a skeleton crew. Essential work only. Protecting what had been built, sealing sections against weather, preventing deterioration. But major progress was impossible. The supply chains that had delivered materials reliably before the war were broken. Prices spiked. What had cost £10 in 1913 now cost 20 or 30. Julius absorbed the increases because stopping completely would have meant accepting defeat. The men who remained on site were older, beyond conscription age, or medically unfit for military service. They worked slowly, carefully, without the urgency that had driven the early years. The war felt distant on Dartmoor, but its effects were everywhere. Food was rationed. Coal was scarce. The newspapers brought news of casualties, long lists of names from Devon villages, some of them men who had worked at Drogo before enlisting. When the armistice came in November 1918, Julius tried to rebuild momentum. He met with Lutyens. They reviewed the designs, looking for economies. Entire wings were cut. The original plan had been vast. What would actually be built was perhaps 2/3 of Lutyens' vision. Julius accepted this. Better a reduced castle that could be finished than a perfect castle that would remain forever incomplete. Labor returned slowly. Men came back from France and Flanders, many of them damaged, looking for work. Wages had risen during the war and did not fall back. Julius paid what was necessary. The stone cutting resumed. The walls climbed higher. But the pace never recovered its pre-war intensity. The world that had made Castle Drogo imaginable, the Edwardian confidence, the belief in permanence was gone. Julius was building a monument to an age that had already ended. While the great hall climbed toward its vaulted ceiling, another structure took shape beneath it. The service quarters. Kitchens, sculleries, pantries, laundries, storage rooms, and sleeping quarters for staff. This was the engine that would make the castle function. The design was Lutyens', but the logic was ancient. Servants existed to maintain the illusion of effortless grandeur. They had to be present yet invisible, always available but never seen unless summoned. The basement at Castle Drogo was a labyrinth. Narrow corridors connected specialized rooms. The kitchen was industrial, built to feed family, guests, and staff. Coal-fired ranges, massive sinks, stone floors that could be scrubbed. The scullery handled dirty dishes and pots. The laundry, with its coppers and mangles, processed linens in volumes that required constant labor. Staff quarters were functional. Small bedrooms, plain furniture, no luxury. The servants who would one day work here, maids, footmen, cooks, gardeners, chauffeurs, would live in a parallel world, connected to the family's world but utterly separate. They would use different stairs, different doors, different spaces. The divide was architectural and absolute. The servants' corridors were deliberately narrow and low-ceilinged. They wound through the castle's foundations, connecting kitchen to dining room, laundry to bedrooms, storage to service areas. Staff could move through the entire building without entering the family's sightlines. This was intentional planning. Lutyens understood that the fantasy of aristocratic life depended on labor remaining invisible. The kitchen was the heart of the basement world. Two large coal ranges provided heat for cooking and for warming water. Preparation tables ran along the center. Copper pots hung from racks. The pantry held dry goods, the larder held perishables, and the game room handled meat from the estate's shooting. Every surface was designed for cleaning tile, stone, metal, nothing soft, nothing that could harbor dirt or odor. Adjacent to the kitchen, the scullery was where the hardest, dirtiest work happened. Washing dishes, scrubbing pots, cleaning vegetables. This work fell to the lowest-ranking staff, usually young girls earning minimal wages. They worked bent over deep sinks, hands in cold or scalding water, day after day. The work destroyed hands. Skin cracked and bled. Complaints were not tolerated. The laundry occupied its own wing. Copper boilers heated water. Linens were boiled, scrubbed on washboards, wrung through mangles, then carried to drying rooms or hung outside when weather permitted. The volume was constant. Bed linens, table linens, towels, staff uniforms, family clothing. A large house generated mountains of laundry. The women who staffed the laundry worked in heat and steam, breathing air thick with moisture and soap. Staff sleeping quarters were small, plainly furnished rooms. A bed, a chair, a small wardrobe. No heating except what drifted from the passages. In winter, the basement was cold. Staff wore layers, slept under heavy blankets. Privacy was minimal. Doors had no locks. The housekeeper inspected rooms regularly. This was home for dozens of people, but it was home without comfort, chosen because alternatives were worse. By 1930, Julius Drew was 74 years old. Castle Drogo had been under construction for nearly 20 years. The house was habitable, but it was not finished. Lutyens' original design had been vast, a sprawling complex with multiple wings, courtyards, and service buildings. Budget and reality forced cuts. Entire sections were abandoned. Wings were simplified. Details were omitted. What stands today is roughly two-thirds of what Lutyens initially envisioned. Even in its reduced form, the cost was staggering. Estimates suggest Julius spent over £60,000, equivalent to many millions today. The fortune he had built from grocery stores was depleted. The castle was magnificent. It was also a financial wound that would never fully heal. Julius moved in. He entertained sparingly. The great hall, designed for banquets and gatherings, echoed with emptiness more often than laughter. The dream had been realized, but the world it was built for no longer existed. The aristocracy Julius had tried to join was fading. Death duties and taxes were dismantling estates across Britain. The age of the country house was ending just as Drogo was completed. Julius walked through his castle in its incomplete state and must have felt the weight of compromise. Corridors ended abruptly at walls that should have opened into courtyards. Staircases led to floors that were never built. The chapel, planned as a soaring space to anchor the eastern wing, was reduced to a small room barely larger than a closet. Every reduction was practical, necessary, but each one diminished the original vision. The great hall stood finished at least, 70 feet from floor to ceiling. Granite walls rising to timber trusses. Windows placed high to throw light down into the vast interior. This was the heart of the castle, the space designed to overwhelm visitors with scale and permanence. Julius held dinners here occasionally, though the room was too large for intimate gatherings. Sound echoed. Conversations required raised voices. The hall was designed for crowds that never materialized. The library, by contrast, was perfectly proportioned, paneled in oak, shelves holding books Julius had collected over decades. This room felt inhabited, personal. It was where Julius spent most of his time reading, writing letters, managing estate business. The castle was his monument, but this room was his refuge. The bedrooms were comfortable but austere. Lutyens had rejected decoration for its own sake. No plasterwork frills, no gilded details. The beauty came from proportion, from the quality of materials, from light moving across stone and wood. The effect was restrained, almost monastic. This was a castle, not a palace. Julius approved. Excess would have undermined the claim to ancient nobility. The Drews, as Julius imagined them, were warrior stock, austere, practical, strong. But at night, walking the corridors, Julius must have heard the silence differently. This was not the bustling household he had imagined. The castle was too large for the family that lived in it. The dream had been realized in stone, but the life it was meant to contain remained elusive. When the Second World War began in 1939, Castle Drogo was requisitioned by the military. The family retained limited use, but most of the building was turned over to officers and administrative functions. Troops were billeted, equipment was stored. The granite fortress, built as a private monument, became a tool of national defense. The house survived the war intact. No bombs fell on Dartmoor. No battles scarred the estate. But the requisition marked a turning point. The Drew family's control over the property was no longer absolute. The castle had entered public service, and that service would continue long after peace returned. Julius Drew died in 1931, just a year after moving in. His widow, Frances, lived on at Drogo until her death in 1954. Their son, Basil, inherited the estate but struggled with the costs. Maintenance was relentless. Heating the castle devoured fuel. Staffing it required wages the family could barely sustain. By the 1960s, the decision was clear. The family could not keep Drogo alive alone. The military presence changed the character of the house. Officers used the Great Hall for briefings and meals. Administrative staff occupied bedrooms. Maps appeared on walls. The library became an operations room. The castle, designed to project timeless aristocratic permanence, was filled with typewriters, filing cabinets, and uniformed men moving with purpose. Frances Drew watched this transformation with mixed feelings. The requisition was necessary. War demanded sacrifices from everyone, but it still felt like an intrusion. The private world she and Julius had built was now public, occupied by strangers whose needs took precedence over her own. She retreated to a few rooms, maintaining a diminished household while the military used the rest. The war years were hard on the building. Military use meant wear. Boots scuffed stone floors. Doors were left open, letting in cold and damp. Maintenance deferred. There were no resources for repairs that were not urgent. Small problems accumulated: a leaking gutter, a cracked pane, plaster that loosened and fell. None of it catastrophic, but all of it adding to a maintenance debt that would come due later. When the war ended in 1945, the military withdrew. Frances reclaimed her home, but it felt diminished. The staff who had run the household before the war were mostly gone. Some had died. Others had found different work. The younger generation had no interest in domestic service. The world was changing, and the feudal structure that had sustained estates like Drogo was collapsing. Basil Drew inherited in 1954. He loved Drogo, but he was not wealthy. The grocery fortune had been spent. What remained was the estate itself, and the estate consumed money without generating enough to sustain itself. Farmland provided some income. Timber could be sold. But operating a castle built to house dozens of staff with a workforce of 5 or 6 was impossible. Rooms stayed closed. Heating was rationed. The dream of permanence confronted the arithmetic of survival. In 1974, the Drew family transferred Castle Drogo to the National Trust. The arrangement allowed the family to remain in residence while the trust assumed responsibility for preservation and public access. It was a pragmatic solution, One repeated at estates across Britain as aristocratic families confronted the unsustainable cost of maintaining grand houses. The trust opened Drogo to visitors. Tours were offered. The public could walk through the Great Hall, climb the towers, and see Lutyens' genius firsthand. For a time, the arrangement seemed stable. Then the walls began to weep. In the 1990s, trust surveyors noticed damp. Not surface moisture, but deep saturation. The granite, which Lutyens had assumed was impermeable, was porous. Water was entering through hairline cracks, soaking into the stone, then freezing in winter and expanding. The freeze-thaw cycle was splitting the granite from within. The damage was extensive, estructurale, potentially catastrophic. The transfer to the National Trust was not simple. Legal agreements had to be negotiated. The family wanted to retain apartments within the castle. The trust needed assurances about access and control. Both sides had legitimate concerns. For the Drews, giving up ownership meant admitting defeat. For the trust, taking on Drogo meant accepting a building whose long-term stability was uncertain. Visitor numbers grew steadily through the 1980s. People came to see Lutyens' only castle, to experience the austere grandeur of the Great Hall, to walk the battlements, and look out over Dartmoor. Drogo became a tourist destination, generating income that helped fund operations. But the trust's surveyors were noticing troubling signs. Damp patches appeared on interior walls. Paint bubbled and peeled. In some areas, plaster crumbled when touched. The trust commissioned studies. Engineers drilled core samples from the granite. What they found was alarming. The stone was saturated with water. Moisture meters registered readings far above acceptable levels. The granite blocks, laid with minimal mortar, had gaps between them. Water was entering through these gaps, through hairline cracks in the stone itself, through failures in the roof system. The granite was supposed to be impervious. Lutyens had chosen it for durability. But Dartmoor granite, for all its hardness, is not completely waterproof. It has microfissures, natural weaknesses. Over decades, water had found these weaknesses. Every winter, that water froze. Ice expands. The expansion forced cracks wider. More water entered. The cycle accelerated. By the late 1990s, the trust faced an unavoidable conclusion. Castle Drogo was failing. The building was less than 70 years old, but it was deteriorating faster than structures twice its age. Without intervention, sections of the castle would become unsafe. Eventually, the building might be lost entirely. The trust had three options: conduct minimal repairs and manage decline, stabilize the building at current condition, accepting some loss of historic fabric, or attempt a full restoration, addressing the water infiltration comprehensively. The first option was unacceptable. The second was temporary. The third was daunting. It would require removing the roof, repairing thousands of stones, and installing modern waterproofing behind historic materials. The cost would be enormous. The trust chose restoration. The National Trust faced a decision: repair Castle Drogo properly or accept that it might be lost. The first option was staggering in scope. The entire roof would have to be removed, every stone checked, damaged blocks replaced, a waterproof membrane installed beneath the roof structure, the walls repointed, drainage systems overhauled. The estimated cost was £10 million, later revised upward to nearly £12 million. The project would take a decade. It would be the most complex conservation effort the Trust had ever undertaken. The second option, managed decline, allowing the castle to slowly deteriorate, was unthinkable. Drogo was a masterpiece, Lutyens' only castle, a statement of early 20th century ambition and craft. Losing it would mean losing a piece of British architectural history that could never be replaced. The Trust committed to the repair. Fundraising began. Engineers were hired. The work started in 2013. Scaffolding rose around the castle, shrouding it in metal and fabric. Visitors could still tour, but they walked through a construction site, watching conservators work stone by stone. Fundraising for a project of this scale required national effort. The Trust launched public appeals. Heritage lottery funding was secured. Donors were courted. The pitch was straightforward. Castle Drogo was unique and irreplaceable. If it was lost, Britain would lose a part of its architectural heritage that had no equivalent. The response was substantial but not immediate. Convincing funders to support a building less than a century old, built by a grocer rather than inherited nobility, required argument. Drogo was not a medieval ruin. It was not a stately home with centuries of history. It was a 20th century fantasy built on invented ancestry. Why did it matter? The Trust's answer was architectural. Lutyens was one of Britain's greatest architects. Drogo was his only castle, a unique fusion of medieval form and modern construction. The building demonstrated early 20th century craftsmanship at its peak. It was also a cultural document, evidence of how self-made wealth tried to purchase legitimacy through architecture. Those arguments worked. Funding came together. The project was approved. The engineering challenges were immense. The roof had to be removed in sections, carefully dismantled so it could be rebuilt identically. Every slate was numbered. Every timber was documented. Beneath the roof, a modern waterproof membrane would be installed, invisible but essential. The membrane would catch water that penetrated the granite and channel it to drainage systems, preventing it from saturating the walls. Repointing the walls required removing old mortar and replacing it with lime mortar, mixed to match the original. Modern cement was not an option. It is too hard, too impermeable. Water would be trapped rather than allowed to evaporate. Lime mortar is softer, breathable, historically appropriate. But mixing and applying it is labor-intensive. Every joint had to be cleaned and refilled by hand. Damaged granite blocks had to be replaced. New stone was quarried from the same Dartmoor source used in 1911. Stonemasons shaped the blocks to match the originals exactly. This was not restoration in the sense of making something look old. It was conservation, preserving original fabric wherever possible and intervening only where necessary to ensure structural integrity. The conservation project finished in 2018. The roof was watertight. The walls were stable. Castle Drogo had been saved, but the process revealed something deeper than structural failure. It exposed the myth of permanence. Julius Drew had built his castle to last 1,000 years. He used the hardest stone, hired the greatest architect, spared no expense. And within 80 years, the building was failing. Not because of poor craftsmanship, but because stone, no matter how hard, is still subject to water, time, and physics. The National Trust's intervention did more than repair Drogo. It reframed the castle's story. No longer just a monument to one man's ambition, Drogo became a case study in heritage preservation, a reminder that saving historic buildings requires ongoing commitment, not just initial grandeur. The workers who saved Drogo, stonemasons, engineers, conservators, mirrored the workers who built it a century earlier. Different tools, different wages, but the same painstaking labor, the same invisible hands keeping a dream alive. The reopening in 2018 was not triumphant. It was quiet, reflective. Visitors returned to a castle that looked unchanged but was fundamentally different. The stone was the same. The silhouette against the sky was identical. But now there was knowledge. Knowledge that permanence is an illusion. That every building, no matter how solid, is temporary without constant care. The National Trust made a decision during the conservation. Instead of hiding the work, they would display it. Exhibition panels explained the water damage. Photographs showed the scaffolding, the removed roof, the conservators at work. The Trust was honest about the building's fragility and the cost of saving it. This transparency marked a shift in how British heritage was presented. For decades, historic houses had been shown as timeless, unchanging, eternal. Drogo's conservation exposed that myth. Buildings survive because people choose to save them. That choice requires money, labor, expertise, and will. Stop choosing and the building dies. The castle today serves multiple purposes. It is still partly a family home. The Drews occupy private apartments. It is a museum, open to the public, generating income through admissions and events. It is an educational site, teaching visitors about Lutyens, about early 20th century ambition, about conservation science. And it is a monument, not to invented Norman ancestry, but to something more complex, to the idea that beauty matters enough to fight for, that buildings can teach us about ourselves if we are willing to listen. Julius Drew wanted Castle Drogo to prove his family belonged. In a sense, it did. Not because the genealogy was true, but because the castle became part of Britain's heritage. It belongs now not to the Drews, but to the nation, preserved not because of ancestry, but because of architecture. The grocer's son built something that outlasted his fortune, his family's control, and his invented pedigree. What remains is the castle itself and the story of every one owner, architect, worker, conservator who built it, saved it, and gave it meaning.